Loner rancher Thomas Avery had imagined a small, delicate woman stepping down from the wagon, someone with gentle hands to tend his garden, a soft voice to ease the silence of his lonely Texas ranch. Instead, when the dust settled on that warm spring afternoon of 1887, he found himself staring at a woman who looked as though she could lift him with one arm. Clara Whitfield stood nearly 6 feet tall in her worn leather boots. Her shoulders were broad from years of ranch work, her stride steady as any cowboy's, and her hands looked more suited to handling reins and branding irons than teacups. The carefully carved oak ring Thomas had carried in his vest pocket suddenly seemed impossibly small. The neighbors had gathered, as they always did when a new mail-order bride arrived in town. A few whispers rose from the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, leaned toward her husband with a hand over her mouth. Young Tommy Morrison actually pointed until his mother yanked his arm down. For Thomas, the whole scene felt like a cruel spectacle, as though every private hope he had poured into those months of letters was being measured against reality before the eyes of the town. Clara looked equally unsettled. Her confident posture faltered as she took in Thomas's slight frame and the way he had to tilt his chin up to meet her gaze. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who had arranged the correspondence, cleared his throat nervously as he jumped down from the wagon seat, eager to busy himself with unloading Clara's trunk rather than face the awkward silence stretching across the yard. At last, Clara spoke. Her voice was deeper than Thomas expected, but not unkind. "You must be Mr. Avery," she said, extending a hand that completely engulfed his when he offered it. Her grip was firm but careful, as though she was conscious of her own strength. "I suppose we should talk." The way she said it made Thomas's stomach tighten. She was having the same doubts that raced through his mind. He had dreamed of a gentle woman who would slip quietly into his life. What he had received was someone who seemed, in every way, larger than life itself. Yet as Clara's sharp eyes swept across the small ranch, the patched corral fence, the modest cabin, the neat stack of firewood, Thomas noticed something surprising. She did not wrinkle her nose or show disappointment. Instead, she nodded approvingly at the tidy vegetable garden he had worked so hard to keep alive through the dry season. For a fleeting moment, Thomas wondered if perhaps she wasn't disappointed in him after all. But then the whispers of the townsfolk carried louder, and the weight of their stares pressed down on him. He had long feared being judged as less of a man, too small, too quiet, too gentle for the frontier. Now, with this towering woman by his side, those fears threatened to drown him completely. And so their story began, not with tender words or a warm embrace, but with doubt, embarrassment, and the uncomfortable truth that God's plans often look far different from the ones we dream for ourselves. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The morning after Clara's arrival, Thomas woke to the sound of shouting that carried across the valley. At first, he thought it was just the Morrison boys roughhousing again, but when the noise swelled into full-blown cries of alarm, his heart sank. He stepped onto the porch and froze. Gideon, his prized Texas Longhorn bull, stood defiantly 3 homesteads away, in the middle of Mrs. Henderson's carefully tended flower garden. The massive beast, nearly 2,000 pounds of muscle and horn, was pawing at the soil, scattering rose bushes that had taken years to cultivate. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose above the chaos, a furious shriek that threatened to peel the paint off her clapboards. Thomas's stomach twisted. Gideon had been his investment, his gamble for the ranch's future. If the bull injured someone, or worse, if word spread that Thomas couldn't control his own livestock, his reputation would be ruined. He gripped the railing, whispering under his breath, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." Psalm 56:3. But the words felt thin against the weight of Gideon's bellow. 2 men had already tried to approach with ropes, only to be driven back by a sweeping charge of horns. Dust clung to their clothes as they scrambled over the fence, their dignity left in tatters. Children were crying, women pulled them back from the fence line, and the men of the town exchanged worried glances, none eager to risk their own hides. Clara appeared beside him without a sound. For such a tall woman, she moved with surprising quiet. Her eyes fixed on the bull, calm but assessing, as though she were measuring a problem she'd solved before. "You can't rope him from the front," she said simply. "He'll see it coming and gore whoever tries." Thomas turned to her alarmed. "Clara, he's dangerous when riled. That animal could kill you." But she was already descending the porch steps, striding toward the chaos. Thomas's pulse hammered. He half ran after her, but his shorter legs could barely keep up. By the time they reached Mrs. Henderson's property, the destruction was plain. Border stones scattered like children's toys. A trampled bed of irises ground into the mud. Mrs. Henderson spotted Thomas and shrieked louder. "You'll pay for every stem, Thomas Avery. If you can't control your stock, you've no business keeping them." Her accusations cut sharper than any blade. He opened his mouth, but words failed him. Clara ignored the fury and vaulted over the fence in a single smooth motion. Gasps rose from the crowd. "Is she mad?" someone whispered. Another hissed, "That bull'll kill her." Thomas's throat constricted. He wanted to shout, to drag her back, but something in her steady movements rooted him in place. Clara approached Gideon in a slow arc, not head-on like the men before. Her hands were empty, palms turned outward. Her voice carried across the trampled garden, low and steady, words more tone than meaning. The massive bull turned toward her, muscles rippling beneath its hide, nostrils flaring. Dust clouded around his hooves as he pawed the earth, preparing for another charge. The crowd held its breath. But Clara didn't flinch. She took another careful step, speaking as though coaxing a nervous child. Gideon's ears twitched, his pawing slowed. Step by step, Clara closed the distance until she was near enough to reach out. With deliberate calm, she laid her hand against the thick muscle of his neck, just behind the ear. The effect was immediate. Gideon's head dropped, his breath huffed out in something like a sigh. Clara scratched gently, the way an old ranch hand might soothe a skittish colt. The bull leaned into her touch, his earlier fury melting into something eerily docile. Whispers rippled through the crowd. She's gentled him," one man murmured, "like he's a house cat." "Rope," Clara called over her shoulder, her eyes never leaving Gideon's. "Bring me a length, quick." Fletcher Knox, the merchant, scrambled to obey, returning with a coil of rope from Thomas's barn. Clara worked with practiced efficiency, fashioning a halter with movements so smooth they looked rehearsed. Within moments, she was leading Gideon out of the wrecked garden. The neighbors parted as she passed, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Mrs. Henderson's prepared tirade died on her lips. Children stared wide-eyed, clutching their mother's skirts. Thomas stood rooted, watching the woman who was supposed to be his bride lead away the most dangerous animal on his ranch as easily as if she were walking a cow to water. His emotions tangled in a knot. Relief that no one was hurt, humiliation that it hadn't been him, and, against his will, something dangerously close to admiration. Clara caught his gaze as she handed Gideon off to a neighbor for safekeeping. A small smile flickered across her face, softening her features. "Your fence has a weak post on the north side," she said casually, as though she hadn't just tamed a 2,000-pound bull in front of half the county. "We should fix it before he gets another idea." The crowd lingered, buzzing with speculation. Thomas felt the weight of their stares again, but this time the heat in his cheeks wasn't just shame. He couldn't shake the memory of Clara's steady hand on Gideon's neck or the quiet strength in her voice. For the first time since she had stepped off that wagon, he wondered if perhaps the woman who seemed far too big for his life might be exactly the one God had intended for it. By the next Sunday, the story of Clara and the bull had traveled faster than wildfire across the prairie. What had begun as a shocking spectacle in Mrs. Henderson's garden had turned into the only subject of conversation at the general store, the saloon, and even the churchyard. At the potluck after service, women clustered near the tables laden with cornbread and stews, whispering behind their fans.
"Did you see how she handled that beast?" one marveled. Another shook her head. "I swear, I thought the horns would take her clear through. And Thomas just stood there like he didn't know what to do." Thomas felt the weight of their voices pressing against his back even when he pretended not to hear. He busied himself with refilling coffee cups, nodding politely, but every chuckle in the corner seemed aimed at him. Samuel Morrison arrived late, as he often did, his 3 strapping sons in tow. He strode through the crowd like a man entering his own barn, slapping backs and booming with laughter. When his eyes found Thomas, a smirk tugged at his lips. "Well now," Morrison said, loud enough for everyone nearby, "I heard it wasn't you but your lady friend who kept Gideon from trampling Mrs. Henderson's roses. Quite the sight, I imagine. Your bride wrangling bulls while you, what was it, held the porch rail?" The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it stung all the same. Thomas's face burned. He wanted to argue, to say he had prayed, that he had been ready to act if things turned worse. But the truth was clear. He hadn't saved anyone. Clara had. Clara, carrying a basket of biscuits, passed close enough to hear Morrison's words. Her expression didn't falter. She offered the man a pleasant nod, then set the basket down among the dishes. "Strong animals respond best to steady hands," she said evenly, "and sometimes the best help is knowing when not to rush in." A ripple of silence followed. Morrison's smirk faltered, though his sons exchanged glances that carried unspoken questions. Clara moved on without another word, but Thomas caught the brief flicker in her eyes when she glanced at him, an understanding and perhaps even sympathy. For all her calm, Clara had noticed the wound Morrison's mockery left behind. Thomas felt it too, raw and sharp. The admiration his neighbors now showered on Clara only deepened his own doubt. If they saw her as the strong one, what did that make him? The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Thomas nor Clara had expected. The ranch, once quiet but orderly under Thomas's steady hand, now echoed with the sound of Clara's strength. Hammer striking post, rope tightening around rails, her voice carrying across the pasture as she guided cattle with ease. Neighbors, still curious after the bull incident, found excuses to stop by. Some offered help with mending fences. Others lingered only to watch Clara swing a sledgehammer as though it weighed nothing. Thomas felt their glances shift between the two of them, silently comparing. Each blow Clara struck seemed to drive his own insecurities deeper into the soil. Yet when the visitors left and silence returned, Clara didn't boast of her skill. She simply continued working. One afternoon, Thomas noticed the skin on her palms reddened raw from the hammer's handle. Without a word, he disappeared into his shed and returned with strips of leather. "Wrap these," he said quietly, handing them to her. She looked at him for a long moment before accepting, her eyes softer than before. Thomas took to the tasks he knew best, tending the vegetable patch, sharpening tools, setting seed rows with meticulous care. Clara, watching from the fence line, remarked once, "I've never seen carrots planted so straight." There was no mockery in her tone, only admiration. Meals became another kind of labor. Clara cooked heartier portions, more accustomed to feeding a crew of ranch hands than just 2 people. Thomas,
not wanting her efforts to go unnoticed, cleared the dishes, scrubbed them carefully, and stacked them to dry. These small exchanges carried a weight words could not. Still, doubt lingered. In the evenings, when the day's work ended and the lantern cast long shadows across the cabin walls, Thomas sometimes caught himself wondering if Clara regretted coming. Her strength highlighted his every shortcoming. He would glance at her broad frame, bent over mending tack, and feel, again, the sting of Morrison's mocking voice. But then there were moments that pulled at him differently. Like the night Clara left a portion of cornbread aside with a quiet, "You've been out in the field longer than I realized." Or the morning she paused by his garden rows, crouching to trace the shoots with a kind of reverence, whispering, "There's more patience in this than in breaking horses." It was in those small gestures that Thomas began to sense something unexpected. Clara didn't merely endure his company. She respected what he brought, even if the town did not. The gossip outside their fence lines hadn't died, but within them something fragile and precious was beginning to take root. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The evening after the bull and the gossip at church, the ranch settled into a silence so thick it pressed down heavier than the summer heat. The day's work had been done, the cattle penned, the tools set back in order, but Thomas lingered on the porch, a tin cup cooling in his hands. Fireflies blinked lazily across the darkening yard, and the first stars pricked the sky. Clara joined him, lowering herself onto the other end of the bench with the kind of weight that made the wood creak. For a long while, neither spoke. The air between them felt charged, as though both carried words too heavy to release. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "This isn't what either of us imagined, is it?" Thomas swallowed, throat dry. He had spent days burying his shame under small talk and chores, but her words cut through his defenses. "No," he admitted, "it's not." He stared at the cup in his hands, the reflection of the lamplight quivering in its surface. "I should have been more honest in my letters," he murmured. "Told you I'm not the kind of man most expect out here."
Not broad-shouldered, not strong, not the sort who can rope a bull with one hand and split fence posts with the other. Out here, men are measured by their muscle, and I come up short every time. The confession hung in the night air, heavy and raw. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see pity in her eyes. But Clara didn't laugh, didn't scoff. Her voice, when it came, carried a weariness that startled him. "Do you know what I've carried my whole life, Thomas? People looking at me and seeing nothing but my size. A challenge, a curiosity. Men trying to best me, women whispering behind my back. Not once did anyone stop to think I might want something simple. Companionship, a home, someone who saw more than these shoulders." She turned then, her profile lit by the lantern glow, her eyes sharp and searching. "I came here because I was tired of being a spectacle. I wanted to be seen for my heart." Her words struck him harder than Morrison's mockery ever could. Here was a woman who had tamed a 2,000-pound bull without flinching, and yet she spoke of the same loneliness that gnawed at him. Silence stretched again, but this time it was different, softer, vulnerable.
Clara's gaze drifted upward, toward the stars, before she spoke again. "There's a verse I've carried since I was a girl," she said quietly. "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." 1 Samuel 16:7. Thomas lifted his head. The words cut through his shame like a blade through rope, loosening the knots he had tied around his own worth. For the first time in days, he dared to meet her eyes. What he found there wasn't pity. It was understanding. "I thought I was the only one carrying this weight," he whispered. Clara shook her head. "No, Thomas, we both came here carrying it. Different burdens, maybe, but the same ache underneath." The porch creaked as the night deepened around them. They sat side by side, two souls laid bare beneath the stars, realizing that what had begun as a bargain struck by letters had brought them face to face with something far greater, the chance to be truly seen. The silence lingered on the porch, but it was no longer heavy. Thomas felt something loosening inside him, a fragile hope threading its way through the shame that had bound him for so long. He reached into his vest pocket, his fingers trembling as they brushed against a small wooden box he had carried since dawn. "I had planned to wait," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "But maybe now is the time." He opened the box and lifted out the ring, a band carved from oak he had felled the winter before. Its surface was smooth in places, rough in others, the grain running unevenly like scars across the wood. Months of patient whittling had shaped it, each stroke a prayer, a hope, a vision of a future he had scarcely dared to believe in. Clara leaned forward, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "You made this?" He nodded, shame already prickling at his neck. 3 months' work, every night by lamplight, after your letters came. But, he swallowed hard as he extended it to her, "it may not fit. I carved it imagining smaller hands than yours." Her lips quirked, a smile hovering between amusement and tenderness. She slipped the ring over her finger, pushing it past the first knuckle before it stopped. The imperfection was glaring, and Thomas's heart sank. His chest ached as if all the doubts of the past weeks had been hammered into that single failure. But Clara only turned her hand in the moonlight, studying the ring as though it were a jewel. Her smile deepened, soft and certain. 3 months, she repeated. You carved this for a woman you had never met, with nothing but hope to guide you. Do you know what that tells me, Thomas? He shook his head, barely able to speak. It tells me you are a man who takes care with important things, who pours patience and faith into his work even when no one is watching. Rings can be reshaped, Thomas. She closed her fist gently around the ring, holding it against her chest. But character cannot. Her words settled over him like balm. What he had seen as failure, she had claimed as proof of his worth. In that moment, Thomas realized the ring was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be a beginning. Clara set the ring carefully back into Thomas's palm, her larger hand closing gently around his. "If you mean to give this to me," she said, her voice low but steady, "then do it properly. Not because a letter arranged it, not because the town expects it, but because you want to." The challenge in her words cut straight to his core. For weeks, he had lived beneath the weight of expectation, of the neighbors, of Morrison's jeers, even of his own fragile hopes. Now she was asking for something truer, a choice born not of desperation, but of desire. Thomas stared at the ring resting in his hand, its rough grain catching the lantern light. He felt the old fear press close again, whispering that he wasn't enough. But another voice stirred inside him, quieter yet stronger, the same one he had called upon in prayer. "Lord, give me the words," he thought. When he looked up at Clara, really looked, he saw not just her strength or size, but the weariness behind her eyes, the longing she had confessed moments ago. And in that gaze, he recognized his own reflection. Taking a slow breath, he stood. His knees wobbled, but his voice grew steadier with each word. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "will you marry me? Not because of letters or arrangements or what anyone else believes we should be, but because I believe we might build something together,
Something good, something lasting, something neither of us could build alone. For a heartbeat, the night held still.
Then Clara rose to her feet, her expression softened by something that looked very much like relief. "Yes," she said simply. The word carried more weight than any elaborate vow, but her smile tilted, warm and wry. "On one condition." Thomas's breath caught. "Condition?" "I want us to resize this ring together. You'll teach me woodwork, and I'll teach you cattle. We'll trade strengths, share burdens, a true partnership." The knot in Thomas's chest loosened fully at last. He smiled, shy but certain, and slid the wooden ring back onto her finger, imperfect though it was. "Then it's a bargain," he whispered. And for the first time since her wagon had rolled into his yard, Thomas felt not small, but whole. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. 6 months later, the valley lay dressed in autumn's finest. Hills painted gold and crimson, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Inside the small clapboard church at the edge of town, the pews filled with neighbors who had gathered not out of curiosity this time, but respect. Thomas stood at the front, his hands folded tight as he waited.
The wooden ring, now perfectly resized, rested in a small box beside him. Beside it lay a second band, one Clara had carved herself from the same oak, matching his work with her own. When the church doors opened, Clara entered. Her figure was still as commanding as the day she stepped off Fletcher Knox's wagon, but her face glowed with a peace Thomas had not seen before. The congregation turned, their whispers hushed into silence as she walked steadily down the aisle. Pastor Hale welcomed them with a nod. "Marriage," he began, "is not a contract of convenience, nor a stage for pride, but a covenant. As Scripture says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up." Ecclesiastes 4:9-10. Thomas's breath caught at the truth of it. That was what he had found in Clara. Not someone to make him smaller, but someone to stand beside him, steady where he was unsteady, strong where he was weak, and willing to be vulnerable where he was strong. When it came time for vows, Thomas took Clara's hands. They still dwarfed his, but the sight no longer shamed him.
Instead, he drew strength from the feel of her fingers wrapped around his own. "Clara," he said, voice clear despite the lump in his throat, "I thought I needed someone gentle to fill the quiet of my life. But what I found was someone brave enough to walk into the storm with me. You've taught me that strength isn't always in muscle, it's in faith, patience, and the will to keep going when life weighs heavy. I promise to walk beside you, not as a master or a burden, but as your partner." Clara's smile was radiant as she answered, "Thomas, I spent years being seen as a spectacle, but you saw my heart. You showed me that home isn't a place, it's a person. I promise to stand with you in drought and in harvest, in silence and in laughter. Where you are patient, I will be bold. Where you are gentle, I will be strong. Together we will not be alone again." The congregation stirred, many brushing away tears. Even Samuel Morrison, who had once mocked Thomas's frailty, sat straighter, his expression softened with respect. At Pastor Hale's signal, Thomas slipped the resized wooden ring onto Clara's finger. This time it fit perfectly. Then Clara placed the ring she had carved onto his hand, a band rougher, less polished, but no less meaningful. "Let no one separate what God has joined together," the pastor declared. The congregation rose in a swell of joy as Thomas and Clara shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Outside, the autumn wind carried the scent of harvested fields as neighbors gathered to congratulate the pair. Whispers of doubt had turned into open admiration. Where once they had seen a mismatch, now they saw a partnership. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber, Clara leaned against Thomas, her voice low so only he could hear. "Do you realize what we've done, Thomas Sloane?" He chuckled softly. "What's that?" "We proved them all wrong, not by being stronger or prouder, but by trusting the Lord's wisdom over men's expectations." She squeezed his hand. "And I think that's the start of something greater than either of us imagined." Thomas looked at her, his heart full. For the first time, he no longer felt the weight of inadequacy pressing on his shoulders. Instead, he felt the truth of another verse stir in his memory. "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Philippians 4:13. And as the bells of the small church rang across the valley, he knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a life they would build, hand in hand, heart with heart. As the last rays of autumn sunlight faded over the valley, the story of Thomas and Clara lingered like a hymn in the hearts of all who witnessed it. Their journey was not just about a marriage, but about what it means to be seen, to be chosen, and to find strength where the world least expects it. Perhaps in their quiet courage, we see pieces of our own longings, our search for belonging, our fear of not being enough, and our hope that love can redeem even the loneliest of lives. The frontier was never only about gunslingers and gold rushes. It was also about ordinary souls carving homes, hearts, and futures against the odds. These are the true Wild West stories, the ones that remind us of faith, partnership, and resilience. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe and share. More tales of the frontier await you.